Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the May. We are in May, right? It's the half the year has gone by. The May session of the Georgetown Center for Business and Public Policy's Little Nuggets of Tech and Telecom. Hi, Jen. How are you?
Good. How are you, Carolyn? You say that so gracefully.
I I can't believe it's we're about to be in the month of June. It's just been amazing how quickly the year has gone by and so much to talk about in our space.
Yes, absolutely.
Super, super excited to have Diana Eisner join us. She is vice president at USTelecom, and I think right in the thick of all of these issues that are swirling. Diana, would you do us the honor of just giving us a sentence or two about your portfolio at USTelecom?
Happy to, and thank you for having me. Really happy to be here with all of you. So I work on all things broadband funding. So we've got ACP, we've got the BEAD, we've got Treasury funding, we've got RDOF, as well as net neutrality, digital discrimination, broadband labels, USF. So the whole gamut of very interesting things that are keeping us all busy, and network modernization to top it all off.
So all things related to funding, I know that's very interesting to Jen and some of the folks that she works with. I guess we can start with BEAD. Let's start there, just because there's been so many different headlines coming out. Can you just, where are we in the process? I know some states have their actual programs, but sort of where are we with that? How many states are left out there to actually have a program, quote unquote, approved? Do you have any idea
Yep.
when the actual money hits the street, so to speak?
I mean, that's the $42.5 billion question. A year ago, I was ballparking that the money would flow mid 2025, but I think that the approval process for the initial proposals has been a little slower than everyone, even NTIA, had expected. So right now we've got 8 states that are approved, which means we have 48 states and territories still waiting for approval. Until that
48.
approval, yes.
Holy,
Um,
that's a
Now,
lot.
Secretary
Wow.
Raimondo did say in a hearing on the Hill, I think it was last week, that they're expecting everything to be done by fall. So fingers crossed on that. But it's only once that volume 2 is approved, and the volume 2 is the meatiest part of it. That describes what all the different programmatic requirements are, what the vetting process will look like for subgrantees. It's only at that point that states can start soliciting applications from subgrantees. And they have 12 months to run their whole process before they have to then submit the final proposal, which will detail the outcome of the whole selection process to NTIA. So, for those 8, we're looking at those proposals being submitted. Louisiana is kind of out there on an
Right.
island a
Right.
bit, and their challenge process took a little longer to get approval on from NTIA. So it's not clear whether theirs will actually be due at the end of December or not. But so we're generally looking at these final proposals being submitted May of 2025.
Wow.
So, then we'll see how with NTIA, with the process and, how long all of that takes. But so, for my money, I'm thinking that the bulk of this money is not going to really roll until maybe second quarter, even, second, third quarter of 2026. Because, the states have to do their thing. NTA has got to approve. You've got to execute all the grant agreements. So, it could even be second half of 2026. But I think that is consistent with what President Biden said last June when they announced state allocations, which was broadband for all by
Mm.
2030, because it's a 4-year deployment. And I think we
Right.
will see some deployments quicker than that. But so, for all of you analysts and everyone following the money, I think we're really looking at the bulk of it second half of 2026.
So, in light of that little thing coming up this year called the presidential election and all of the other, state and local elections, um, is there any chance that programs are modified or changed once if there are different folks in the White House or in the governor's offices, or is what is baked and that's what's going to be followed?
So I think from the state perspective, as long as the approvals from NTIA are in before any state elections, I think that those approvals from the state perspective will stay as they are, which was a big reason why Louisiana really went first, because they had the administration change over in January and they wanted to make sure everything was baked. I think in terms of the White House and the administration, that's sort of what we're all really trying to scratch our heads about right now, because I think that's why NTIA, to their credit, they're working tremendously hard. They have stood up a team that to me is unprecedented in terms of the talent and just the sheer volume because of everything. But I think that is sort of a concern of, well, what could happen next January? Could someone come in and say, at this state, I don't really like this, so let's rethink this. It's going to be a little more complicated. And that's why I think that we all thought this would move a little bit quicker. But I think just the sheer volume of this has been overwhelming for states and for NTIA. I mean, this is really just, this program is so unprecedented.
So go ahead, Jen.
Sorry, and Carolyn, for you too. But regardless of the election, BEAD has a bow on it. I mean, it can't be reverse course if the administration changes. Is that right?
Correct. That money has already been appropriated. It's sitting, in a box at Treasury, waiting to be used and doled out to commerce in the states. So, while some of what the program looks like, it's possible could change around the edges, but because so much of what makes up the program was passed into law in the IIJA, the core of it will stay the same.
Got it. Thanks, Carolyn. Sorry.
Sticking with the theme of funding, for those who are not based inside the Beltway, there is a massive conversation going on how we think about and what we need to be doing for the sustainable version of the Universal Service Fund. And I say version because we're not quite sure exactly what that will look like. But could you bring us up to speed in terms of who on the Hill, which members are, and I don't mean to the person, but just generally, where is the locus of this energy? Who's driving it? And what should we expect to be seeing this summer, if anything?
Well, so the USF working group, which is a bipartisan working group, is working tremendously hard to reform the contribution system to broaden the base significantly. Right now, the USF base it's an anachronism. It only includes the telcos. And, part of this goal, I think, was spurred by the Affordable Connectivity Program, which expires on Friday. And, the hope is to move ACP into USF when it has a more expanded base. So we're really looking at not only reforming the base, but reforming the program. So, USTelecom has been on record for a while saying it's appropriate to make the USF fund more of an operational expense fund post BEAD versus right now it's capital expenses and operational expenses. But there are a lot of areas, so BEAD is only a capital expense reimbursement. There's no ongoing support for operational expenses. But there are all of these areas of the country where, you may have 50, 60 customers on your network. And the revenue from those customers alone cannot sustain the operating costs of these networks. Broadband is not set it and forget it. These networks need ongoing customer support. There's maintenance. Someone needs a new router. I mean, fiber cuts can happen. There are all kinds of reasons why you need ongoing money to keep these networks going. And so USF is going to be tremendously important to make sure that this huge contribution from BEAD and this huge investment actually can remain in the long term, that these networks can survive after that 4-year funding period. So making USF more focused on those ongoing operational expenses will be really important. And again, we've been a really big supporter of contributions reform. Those who benefit from these networks should pay under Section 254. It's the same way that back when we all got our DVDs from Netflix had to pay the postal service for a stamp to mail the DVD and to have it mailed back. There's no reason why all of these companies should continue to ride these networks for free when they are such a source of the need for ongoing maintenance and additional capacity. So we think that the work of this group is so important. In terms of timing, I wish I could predict that. I'd be in a different line of business if I had that crystal ball. They've been working for a while. We hear rumors week to week. it could be any day, but, Congress is just so busy. And, as we've talked about a bit, we're going into the election season, which condenses the time frame even more. So we just don't really know. But, we're hopeful that a draft will be put out, soon. And then, everyone can comment and things will go from there.
So two quick reactions. Well, actually, one reaction, one question. Yeah, what I heard you saying is that there is in this conversation, and I do want to know kind of who's driving it, because I understand it's bipartisan and bicameral, which is sort of extraordinary for issues these days on the Hill, is that people who are benefiting from these networks should be helping to defray that cost, that postage stamp, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if you think about it, I think the way in which this conversation was, some people were trying to reduce it to, well, you just want other people other than the ISPs to pay for, something that you guys should be shouldering. When in fact, there's precedent, isn't there, at the FCC, where if you take a look at functionality and consumer expectations and who's benefiting by having more consumers online, well, certainly the folks who are operating the networks will benefit from that, but also all of these other companies, from social to search to digital to you name it, would all seem to be, part of the focus. Although I understand there's a tough fight, because obviously nobody wants to pay even a penny, no matter how strong the equity arguments are. So I think that sounds like a hard one. But who can you give us a little idea of who's driving this politically? Is it, senior members, so that we actually have a sense that something might actually happen? Or is this more down dais folks who, it's a passion project and we may not actually see something real come out of it?
I think there are senior members who are very much engaged. I think that ACP has really spurred a lot of people to action on this. While the funding lapse for ACP is very upsetting to, everyone, like USTelecom and its members have been a huge supporter of this program. Our members stepped up to the plate, rolled this out in record time. So to see it go away is really, upsetting. But I also think that it's been a good thing in some ways, because it has spurred Congress to action. So, I think that you really do have some senior people who have their voices out there and who can really lend some support to it. And I do think there is a lot of desire to reach the end game, which is how it is, as you said, bipartisan, bicameral. That really is remarkable. We don't see that every day.
And last one on this topic, I promise. Is there going to be, is there any money that has been identified in any of this legislation or in any of these programs? Or is there just a desire, for example, by either at NTIA or the FCC, to do a sanity check once this money goes out, to identify on the access side what's actually left to be closed in terms of a digital divide, and then separately an ongoing way to stay in touch with what the adoption looks like?
I don't think those numbers have been put out there yet. I just think it's not possible. I know, so RDOF, when RDOF rolled out in, 2019, there was the idea that there was going to be RDOF phase 2. Because of BEAD, there hasn't been an RDOF phase 2. So it may be what was contemplated as RDOF phase 2 ends up being, did we miss some areas? Are there still underserved that need to be upgraded? So there could be some kind of capital expenditure fund to close any remaining gaps. And then I think that the FCC is going to have, if the FCC does retain USF, which we expect it will, that the FCC will have to then sort of look at what are the costs needed for these networks and do cost studies like it's done for other programs in the past.
Right. That makes a lot of sense.
Diana, could I ask also, involved in my world is a lot of private capital or infrastructure money coming to fiber, especially in the rural areas. And I'm curious, there kind of has been a pause on that. I mean, like if you rewind the clock to 2022, every fiber company seemed to have its share of infrastructure investors knocking at their door. How do your members think about that? And how do you think actually the government thinks about private capital coming in? Are they more cautious? Are they excited? How do they think about that?
Well, I think that investment from private capital has been huge. In 2022, the numbers were, I believe, that 102.4 billion in private capital alone. So I think, some of that may have slowed down too, because there's going to be this huge influx of money coming in. And so I think some of this is we had the pandemic, we saw how critical fiber was, and providers are still working on deploying to locations on their business as usual plans. But I think in terms of some of this rush that we saw with the pandemic hitting, I think people are sort of taking a bit of a step back to say, like, let's see what the program requirements are for these areas. Because I think also the last thing that you want to do as an investor and as a company is start these plans and start the process of deploying a network in an unserved area, only to have it then be eligible for BEAD, because under some of these challenge processes, if you don't have service turned up in June of this year, even if you're going to turn it up in a year from June before the BEAD network is, that area is still eligible. So I think there's been some of this, like, let's actually wait and see what the areas are and what they look like to make sure that we're being as strategic and as efficient with these monies as possiit
Yeah.
As a taxpayer, I think that actually makes sense.
I agree.
Let's see if it happens, but it makes eminent sense. Diana, you raised RDOF. First of all, for folks on the audience who are not, in the weeds like us three nerdy ladies, can you explain what RDOF is?
Yes.
And my question was, we had heard, I might have actually read it in the trade press, that there was a filing submitted to the FCC where folks who had successful bids in RDOF were essentially asking the FCC to basically say, actually, we were just kidding. You don't actually have to build out. And oh, by the way, these folks are also asking for the ability to go and apply for BEAD money in the same areas that they had just reneged on their RDOF commitments to. So what is RDOF and what is going on with this request for a free pass?
So RDOF, and I like the way you put a free pass, I support that. So RDOF is the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund. It rolled out in 2019. The auction was in November of 2020. And what makes this interesting, and so it is for areas that were still unserved at least 25.3. And so what we saw and what made this very interesting is this was the first high cost auction other than the CAF2 auction, which was a couple years prior, but it was much smaller in scale. I mean, there was 16 billion available for this auction, and it covered just a huge amount of areas. So what we saw, an interesting phenomenon we hadn't previously seen, where, and I think it was probably anticipated, where you had a lot of newer entrants and providers like LTD Broadband that had never deployed fiber, just saying, we're great, government money, we're going to do this, and we're going to bid at a rock bottom price so that we can get it. You have the established providers then in this process dropping out, after however many rounds, because they say, this is not doable. We can't do this. And so you end up with these winners who really were not prepared for what this actually took, and who I think, might have gotten caught up in the excitement of an auction. It's why we're all very careful when we go to auctions. And really we're not being thoughtful about the cost. This was not a boondoggle in terms of the FCC paying all of this money. There was going to be a lot of money that had to be borne by the provider as a match. And this was a subsidy, a pure subsidy with the provider contribution. So now, a few years later, as they're reaching deployment milestones and as they're realizing, oh no, like, what do we do? You have these providers who are saying, oops, we made a mistake. Some are blaming rising costs, but I can tell you that a lot of providers, including USTelecom members, there have been rising costs, but those providers who bid knowing what they were doing and who were really thoughtful and, not just trying to get in and get market entry, they're shouldering those costs because they know how to do it. They are in the business of broadband and they can do it. But so these other providers are saying, yeah, we can't do this. We made a mistake. FCC, the first proposal was give us more money. And I think the FCC made it very clear, like, that's never happening. We have a ballooning contribution factor. It's not as if the RDOF money was allocated the way BEAD money is. It's based, you get what you need every quarter based on, and you do the contributions factor accordingly. So the FCC said, no way. But they said, let's think about, do we give you all some kind of limited amnesty period? what would that look like? So what USTelecom put forth was, in the interest of getting these areas served by BEAD, because it serves no one's interest that for the next 7 years, these locations sit unserved and that they're not eligible for BEAD. And then someone has to go back and deploy to them. Like, we want everyone connected. Americans need to be connected. It's, this is our global security, it's our economic security. And so what we proposed was open an amnesty window for a month. Providers can come in, they can say, these are the census block groups, which was the bidding unit we want to give back. That way there's no cherry picking certain locations. And in exchange, you get a 50% penalty reduction. So, and also part of it that we thought was critical is no double dipping in BEAD. If you give back a census block group, you cannot serve those same locations via BEAD, because we were concerned, and I think there is a sense in industry about this, of gamesmanship, where providers would go out there and say, we're giving back RDOF because we were only getting, I don't know, $1,000 a location. We're going to try and BEAD, and maybe in BEAD we can get 10,000 a location. So I think the FCC is still considering what to do, but this is all, it's such a delicate dance, because you have states who are already running their challenge processes. They've already figured out what the cost per location is. Putting in more locations could upset that. And, there's so much happening here with BEAD that I think if the FCC wants to do something, it probably needs to be sooner rather than later, so that states can put those locations back in. Because right now, under the terms of the BEAD Notice of Funding Opportunity, RDOF has to come out.
Right. Wow.
And that's what I was going to ask. Is it does, you could make the case bad actors were found in RDOF. And do you feel like there's enough bear traps or traps in place to prevent that fully from BEAD, since it's exponentially so much more money? Or does
this has been a big thing for USTelecom. And I would say one of our big talking points is, experience matters. And ever since we filed comments with NTIA back in January of 22 on what would be in the NOFO, we emphasized the need for vetting because of LTD broadband. And now that situation has only ballooned. And so we think it's just critically important that states be very clear and certain, and that NTI do the same in reviewing about who these providers are, what their capabilities are, what their business plan is, and making sure that the prices they're putting forth are actually sustainable. Because with some of these states and with some of the NTIA requirements, like a low-cost offering and scoring on affordability, you're inviting another race to the bottom. It's not an auction, but it's a race to the bottom nonetheless. And you may have a provider who says, I'm going to offer everyone gigabit service for $20 a month for the next 15 years. And that a state really would have to peel back that onion and figure out, is that actually going to work? Because I don't know of a provider out there who can make that work, especially in these very rural areas where you've got, however, a few homes per, mile sometimes. So we're really watching that carefully, and we've really tried to continue to emphasize that point, especially in light of this RDOF, give me more money, let me out of jail free card request, that this is why experience and the analysis of these proposals is so important.
So I'm just looking at my clock, and I think we have about 5 more topics. So I don't think we're going to be able to fit them all in. I'm going to throw out 2, and then Jen, I'm going to move it over to you. I don't want to say it, but I have to say it because we would be remiss if we didn't. Net neutrality. Why are we? Why? I'm not even going to ask why, because we know why. But we're here again. Instead of the usual sort of what's next steps, because I think this is all going to keep going back and forth. I was wondering if we could tease out something specific, and that is, I thought there was a lot. I mean, I might have misapprehended, but I thought there was a lot of discussion coming out of the chairwoman's office that there was going to be preemption of the states in some areas, in particular rate regulation, and that this order and net neutrality push is not about rate regulation. And yet I read a piece, an analytical piece this morning, that highlighted the language that was added to the net neutrality order at kind of the last minute, which might call into question how extensive the preemptive effect might be of whatever is actually finalized in net neutrality versus, what states are potentially interested in doing, for example, New York with their mandated $15 or $20 rate plan. So I'm just curious, when you guys are looking out over the next many months on something like net neutrality, or I guess I could say a couple years, God help us, where where does this all end up, do you think? Are we just, back and forth for forever, or does this rate regulation issue just take the entire conversation in a different direction than it's been in?
I think the rate regulation issue is a huge concern. I will say that I read that language in the order as saying that if a state were to do something like its own version of ACP, where it's a subsidy affordability program, that is allowed, but that pure rate regulation, such as the $15 New York offering, is not.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that there is a case to be made that state rate regulation, that is just pure rate regulation, would be preempted, and even rate regulation under the guise of affordability.
Right.
We were very heartened, I will say, by the FCC changing the draft of the item back in October because at first it only said ex ante rate regulation. Now it's ex ante and ex post. So I think that was helpful. And we do appreciate how forcefully the commission did come out in many ways with rate regulation. I think, that sentence that was added is maybe not ideal, but I do think that there is a big distinction between an affordability program, which is what ACP is, which is what Lifeline is. Those are subsidies versus mandated price offerings.
Yep.
But I do think, the rate regulation aspect, it's always been a concern, but I think that it brings even, a new color to this in this go around.
Mm-hmm. Tech transition.
Yeah.
I know that's a really important issue. It ranks right up there with copper theft as, an issue that it's really hard to get people excited about it, but absolutely critical to so many parts of our foundational economy in the 21st century. Can you explain, when you guys talk about tech, what is that? Tell us what that is.
Sure. So tech transitions in our parlance means the transition from the old copper networks that, in some cases are maybe 150 years old, to the fiber networks of now in the future that, consumers demand, that we all need to do everyday life. Copper networks, they were state of the art at the time. They just don't cut it anymore. And there is no reason now, as USF has changed, so has the obligations that once went along with USF. So, some of these regulatory obligations that are anachronistic from the time of, everyone needing telephone service, things are just really different now. And having to maintain these copper networks while you're trying to get fiber to your customers, because your customers need fiber, just doesn't make sense anymore. So we as a country really need to make the decision that, copper was great. It was great while it lasted, but maybe like traditional light bulbs, since now it's all about the LEDs, you got to get rid of those old light bulbs and now turn us all on with LEDs and, bless all of the providers turning down those copper networks, which they're expensive to maintain. In terms of telephone lines, I think only 1.3% of Americans are landline only, and landlines can be delivered via fiber, via cable. So even a smaller percentage of those are on a copper landline. That this just doesn't make sense anymore. And that money that we're investing, those energy hours that you're needing for the server rooms to keep the switches cool for the fiber networks, that it's just not worth it anymore. And that we need to all transition to fiber. So that's really what this is about. It's about, embracing the next generation of technology, which is what people need. No one can stream on a copper network. You could Zoom, you could do telehealth, but but most customers, what they're really using, they're using the streaming, they're using the gaming. You can't do that on a copper network. So, as a country, we're so forward looking on so many things. We need to take that approach to broadband too and say, there's no sense in maintaining dual networks anymore.
And that mashes up nicely with this surge of money into the sector from the federal government, potentially.
Exactly.
Jen, over to you to bring us home with the final question of the day.
Well, I mean, I guess I'll just start with big or end with a big open-ended one. Kind of on your to-do list every day, what's the hardest part as you look out over the next 6 months to accomplish?
So at least for me personally, every scenario I'm gaming out, I game out in two different ways, depending on which way the election goes. And so it's really requires a lot of creative thinking and a lot of, all right, so like this happens, what does that mean for this? And if this happens, what does it mean for the same thing? So there's just so much uncertainty out there right now. And yet it's such an important time for telecom that just trying to gaming out all those different scenarios and kind of coming up with the A and the B in each case is definitely a challenge.
Any issues we haven't touched on that you see becoming much more relevant after the election? I'm not going to say AI because I'm so tired of hearing about it already, and we're really just at the beginning of that whole conversation. But AI, privacy, anything that we haven't touched on here that you potentially see exploding?
I think AI and privacy are going to continue to be big.
Yeah.
I think AI now with that, the guy in New Hampshire who's been indicted and fined $6 million from the FCC, Scarlett Johansson in the news about her voice being hijacked. I think AI is just going to be the train that keeps on chugging at warp speed. So, I think even in some ways, I think that may become more of the focus than privacy. We would love to see a national privacy framework, but I think that AI has a lot more attention now. And of course, they're related.
Sure.
But yeah, I think AI is just going to be all hands on deck for the next year to 5. I guess we're going to have to see.
Thank you very, very, very much, Diana, for making the time and agreeing to be our featured speaker this month. You were a fantastic guest. We'd love to have you back. And I know I'm a lot smarter after hearing all of the details about these subsidy programs and funding mechanisms. Jen, as always, it was fantastic to see you. I think for all the folks who are watching and listening, we'll be convening for a June session. We'll get that date out. And then I think we're going to take the months of July and August off. But then in advance of the election, we will have a very robust event in September. So folks should stay tuned. And I want to thank everyone for joining us. And Diana, again, thank you very much.
Thank you,
Diana. We'll see everyone. Enjoy these June days. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Jen.